Welcome to another episode of Facts. This is a special episode. You know me. I enjoy doing anything with J.R.R. Tolkien's work, Lord of the Rings, Silmarillion. We talk about quite a bit of that. We had a whole special episode recently with C.R. Wiley, Presbyterian minister who wrote a book on Tom Bondeville called In the House of Tom Bondeville. If you missed that, please make sure you go back and listen to that episode. But today's another special episode because we're having another author on who's talking about J.R.R. Tolkien. And if I can find anybody that's writing about his life, his writings, his ideas, and especially his spirituality, I'm going to do everything I can to have them on. So I'm going to bring on my special guest, Dr. Holly. It's good to have you on with us today. I've got your biography here and a little bit about you as a writer. You're in the Cardinal Francis George Professor of Faith and Culture at the Word of Fire Institute and a visiting professor of apologetics at Houston Christian University, which to me and anybody that listens to Facts, you guys all know at this point that Word on Fire is highly recommended. Dr. Barron, or with Bishop Barron and his work and research. You also hold a PhD in English from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and then you're a subject editor of the Journal of the Inkling Studies, which I can't even imagine how much fun you have. I just can't even imagine how much fun you have. And you've written 2 books now on this. You've written Tolkien's Modern Reading, Middle-earth Beyond the Middle Ages, which was just in 2021. And then you turned this around and just produced Tolkien's Faith, a Spiritual Biography, in September of 2023. So you've been busy. You've been very, very busy. So tell us a little bit about yourself in addition to that in the writings you're doing.
Oh, well, I mean, you've kind of covered all the bases for what I do. I'm a writer. I'm a speaker. I do lecturing, both in the US and in the UK. And my specialty is Tolkien. And these 2 books come together very nicely because I wrote Tolkien's Modern Reading as a 10-year project. That book took me 10 years to research and to write. It was a deep dive into everything that Tolkien had read of modern literature, 1850 onwards. What did he think about it? And massive research project where I looked at every scrap of data I could get my hands on of interviews with him, interviews with his friends, his family, his students, his colleagues, anybody who chatted with him for 5 minutes in the street. If they wrote about it, I took it down, read, everything that he had written to get a sense of what had he read, what was his exposure to modern literature. And out of that came Tolkien's Modern Reading. But as I was writing that book in this 10-year epic journey, I kept coming up with information about his faith. Now, I knew that he was a serious Catholic, kind of background knowledge, but I had always sort of assumed that it was a bit compartmentalized. Like, okay, he was a Catholic, but his main work was this. His main work was academic. He was a writer. Since his fiction is not directly Christian, overtly Christian in the same way that, say, C.S. Lewis's fiction is. It's easy to kind of compartmentalize it. And that's pretty much how most of the biographical treatments of Tolkien had handled it. Okay, yeah, he's a serious Catholic, yeah, but this is not really terribly relevant. In fact, one of the biographers of Tolkien, Raymond Edwards, in an otherwise excellent biography, literally puts his faith in an appendix. It's all just literally compartmentalized at the back of the book. But as I was researching Tolkien's Modern Reading, I kept finding that he would talk about his faith very openly in interviews. He was very direct about it. And then as I did the deep dive into the biographical material to learn about his life of the mind, I kept finding a lot about the life of faith. And that meant that I was getting quite a lot of notes piled up in my files. And so I decided after finishing Tolkien's Modern Reading that, okay, now it's time to do the deep dive into his faith. And I had a head start. And that's to kind of hit the ground running with this second book.
That's so incredible. And to do another book in a 2-year span, but like you said, there was a lot of pre-work that went into that brought out all these ideas. It just almost wrote itself. The second book seems like it almost wrote itself after doing the investigation. The first, it was like, I'm going to put this off to the side. I'm going to come back to this. This is good. Like, this is really good. So, and just kind of going with that, what inspired you to write a biography specifically? Like you mentioned, Edwards has written a biography. I believe Carpenter and Michael White, they've all written biographies. You obviously saw that there was something that could be a little bit different than what they had put, although I think all of them did a good job. I've read most of them. So what made you go, okay, there's other biographies out there, but I think this can add some nuance and some light to things that are not talked about in those biographies?
Well, this is a great question, because when I was doing my work for Tolkien's Modern Reading, I was having to come to grips with what was said about that topic in the other biographies. And one of the big sort of breaking news of Tolkien's Modern Reading is that all the biographers were asserting that Tolkien had no interest in modern literature, that he was dismissive. He only cared about, the old stuff. And Humphrey Carpenter, his authorized biographer, goes so far as to say that he read almost nothing of modern fiction and took no real notice of it. And that's a pretty straightforward statement from his authorized biographer. The only problem is it's actually not correct. It's completely not correct.
Wow.
And I demonstrated that with quotes from Tolkien, with the hard evidence. These are the books that he owned. These are the books on his shelves. These are the books that he commented on. He actually read widely in modern literature and had lots of things to say about it, including some very direct references to how he was influenced by it. He read everything from James Joyce to Beatrix Potter to Agatha Christie. And that really reshaped my attitude towards the biographical data, because I realized that people have often fallen into a rut of kind of making some assumptions about Tolkien that maybe are partially true or generally true, but not totally true. So, for instance, with his reading, yes, he loved medieval literature.
Yeah.
Yes, medieval literature and language was hugely important. I would even say much more important than his modern reading. But that doesn't mean that he didn't do any modern reading or that it wasn't important at all. So I was complexifying. I was adding more nuance. And then I turned to the biographical treatments of his faith, and I discovered there's the same problem. There's a kind of flattening out. And I had learned in doing the research for Tolkien's Modern Reading that Humphrey Carpenter didn't have a good sense of Tolkien's personality at all. He really was not in the same wavelength. In fact, he quite disliked Tolkien, as it turns out.
Interesting.
And he's on record in several interviews as saying that on record, mind you, Carpenter saying this in a published interview, that he went into the project desiring to tear down some idols, wanting to tarnish the reputation. He wanted to annoy the fans, and that he sort of was not that concerned about biographical accuracy. He said, oh yeah, this again, I'm thinking of a published interview. He said, I could look at the same material and do two totally different biographies. And he was fine with that. And so that alerted me to the fact that there's a lot of interpretation going on. Now, all biographers have to interpret, but a good biographer tries very hard to link it to the facts, and you shouldn't be able to tell two dramatically different stories about the same author. And then we come to the fact that Carpenter admitted that he had a chip on his shoulder about Tolkien's whole ethos. Carpenter was antagonistic to the academic ethos of Oxford. And Carpenter, when he wrote the biography of Tolkien, was at that point an atheist with a grudge against sort of organized religion, because his dad was the Anglican bishop of Oxford and he had broken away from the faith. Now, I got to give Carpenter this amount of credit, that he does acknowledge Tolkien's serious Catholic faith. He names it, he acknowledges it, but oh boy, he does not understand it. He doesn't understand it, and he doesn't try.
Yeah.
And so that's a huge, just missed opportunity. And subsequent biographers have just sort of followed that. And when I went back and I looked at the biographical accounts of Tolkien's life at his faith, I started to see these huge gaps. And here, my own personal experiences came into play because I am myself a Catholic, I'm a convert, and I've had a lot of my faith experience shaped by English Catholic culture. I am in an extremely privileged position as an American academic that for about the last 15 years, I spend about 3 months of the year in Oxford. I
Hmm.
there is a kind of a part-time local, and of course I do research in the Bodleian Library and all that. But I also walk the same streets that Tolkien walked. I shop in the
Hmm.
same places, and I worship in the same churches. And so that has allowed me to get to know English
Wow.
culture, English people, specifically Oxford, that he spent most of his adult life in. And I started to realize that there is so much, first, about English culture that Americans don't understand. And then there's so much about English Catholic culture that even American Catholics don't understand. It's a very, very different world. Um, and that was something that I had access to that had not been presented in any other biography.
That's actually very. The more you bring that up about Humphrey Carpenter, it's been a while since I've read but it seems like in his biography there is a little bit of a chip on his shoulder when he's writing. Like now that you say that, it's like, you know what? I do remember them being kind of unforgiving at times or very wave the hand kind of idea. So it even shows up in the biography, I would say. Now that you bring that, I think it's an excellent observation. Now, when you were doing your research, did you find anything about how Tolkien's faith influences works? I know he specifically says when he was asked, and he said it's a Catholic work, but was there anything in it that really was surprising to you? Like, wow, I didn't expect to see that. I always thought it would be this way, but wow, it's right there. Was there one of those moments that really gripped you?
Well, I wouldn't say specifically a moment, but there was a huge insight that I had that I think is a new insight, if I may say so. And that is the role of the congregation of the Oratory of St. Philip Neri in
Hmm.
Tolkien's life and its influence on the Lord of the Rings.
Wow.
Now, when I back up a little bit, most people who are Tolkien fans are well aware that he was orphaned at a relatively young age, and that after his mother died, he was under the guardianship of Father Francis Morgan, a Catholic priest.
Yep.
And you may have heard, yes, he was at the Oratory in Birmingham. Okay, but what most people don't know, and in fact, what I didn't know until I really dug into it, is that the Oratory isn't just the name of a church that happens to be in Birmingham. The Oratory is the Oratory of the Congregation of St. Philip Neri, which is actually a religious congregation. It's a whole mode of life, it's a whole ethos.
Hmm.
It's based, it was founded by an Italian priest, Philip Neri, in Rome in the 1600s. And forget the date right, which I probably don't. And to, John Henry Newman, the great figure of English
Oh, yes.
culture, Anglican and Catholic, when he became a Catholic, he decided that the Oratorian ethos, the Congregation of St. Philip Neri, was the right fit for him and for his friends. So he brings the Oratory to Birmingham and founds the very first Oratory of the Congregation of St. Philip Neri in Birmingham. And that's where Father Francis Morgan, Tolkien's guardian, was one of a community of priests, many of whom Tolkien became good friends with. So he's growing up not just mentored by a Catholic priest, but in a very specific ethos, a specific congregation that's quite
Wow.
distinctive, that's been founded, nurtured, and shaped by John Henry Newman, that giant
That's
of English culture.
crazy.
And Francis Morgan, his guardian, was actually Newman's student and one of his personal secretaries.
That's fun. That is exciting because you know that trickled into Tolkien, like that passed down. There's so much influences there too. And Newman's one of the hero. I mean, he's one of the heroes that I enjoy. I mean,
He was a
Tolkien
tower.
was that close.
He was. There's in Tolkien's faith. I'm so excited to found this picture in the photo gallery of Tolkien's faith. I have a photograph that shows his guardian, Father Francis Morgan, in a group picture with Newman.
No.
Just one step away.
Well, so kind of keeping with that, can you elaborate on how specific Catholic doctrines and practices can be reflected in his work? Say, Lord of the Rings, Hobbit, Silmarillion. Where did the doctrines and theology, now that we see, like, okay, he was in this framework, this is the ethos that he was in, how did that play out in his writings? Where do we start seeing the influence of that come out in his different writings?
Well, a lot of, I mean, that's a larger question.
Sure.
And of course, there's so much that's what's just we call merely Christian. All of the, the emphasis on the resurrection, for instance, is pivotal. But that's Catholic, but not exclusively Catholic. But I want to come back to the Congregation of St. Philip Neri. That specific influence, because that's where I think we see certain very strong influences in shaping Tolkien's whole attitude and eventually shaping Lord of the Rings. Because there's a couple key features about the Oratory. One is that it emphasizes the intellectual life. There's a high emphasis on learning, on study. Most of the Oratorian fathers that Tolkien knew were converts. They were converts from Anglicanism. So he grew up in an environment where people understood Anglicanism and weren't afraid of it. This is in a context where during his youth, it was very difficult to be a Catholic. There's a huge amount of prejudice. There's social bias. There's fewer opportunities. It's very easy at that time for Catholics to be very inward looking and sort of self-protective out of self-defense, basically. But Tolkien grew up in an environment where he was encouraged to be more kind of outward looking. And also there's the intellectual life. But the whole ethos of St. Philip has two important strands. One is humor and one is humility. And they're related because St. Philip, in all of his teachings to his Oratorians, emphasizes the need for humility, to avoid spiritual pride, to stay grounded, to be humble. Well, his advice for being humble was to not take yourself too seriously. You had to take the spiritual life seriously. You had to take God seriously. You had to take your faith seriously, but not take yourself too seriously. So the whole ethos of the Oratorians has a playfulness to it. There are lots of stories of Philip Neri, the founder, just kind of playing jokes and tricks, lighthearted, fun ones, again, with a serious spiritual lesson of humility. And this was such an insight for me, because it accounted for something that always kind of puzzled me about Tolkien. When we get to the stories of the end, near the end of his life, he's a famous figure. He's published The Lord of the Rings. He's a big deal, but he still acts in quite silly ways sometimes. He at a lecture, he pulled out this little withered green thing and declared that it was a shoe of a leprechaun and stuck to it, no matter how much people were quizzing him on it. He was perfectly happy, as a father and a grandfather, to dress up like a polar bear at a children's party. And yeah, that's fine. He didn't stand in his dignity. There was one instance when he was buying something in a shop and he accidentally passes his dentures to the shopkeeper along with his loose change. And like, what? This is all so silly. And I had always wrestled with, how is it that this great author, why isn't he a little bit more sort of dignified? And I realized after doing this deep dive that that's actually traces all the way back to his spiritual formation at the Oratory.
Wow.
And it kept him humble. He never got puffed up. Even when he was a famous author, he's always down to earth. He's always a little self-deprecating. He enjoyed having the money that came in from the Lord of the Rings, but he used it on relatively simple things. Like, okay, he bought a bungalow so that he and his wife Edith could go live, in Bournemouth. It wasn't a mansion; it was a little bungalow, and he gave away a lot of money. In fact, when it came time for his old age pension to kick in, he actually gave away all that money because he didn't need it.
Wow.
And he didn't make a big deal about it. So that humility was really core to who he was as a Christian. And I saw that it actually makes its way very powerfully into the Lord of the Rings, because the Lord of the Rings is all about Sauron is defeated, but by whom? By the hobbits, the little people, the most humble. They're weak. They're not warriors.
Mhm.
They're not even
Mhm.
particularly wise or strong. Frodo's just kind of an average guy. He's just an
Yep.
average hobbit. He's nobody. He's nobody special. Um, and it's all through their humility. They're literally humble and being closer to the earth because they're little. They're the little people. And so in all of this, it's really an embodiment of that whole, the line from the Gospel of Luke where Mary's giving her song of praise. It's all about that the Lord is exalting the humble and bringing the mighty low. So that the hobbits are actually a profoundly Catholic image. They have that sort of Marian humility. They're a profoundly
Mhm.
Christian image because, again, that humility is so central. Be like little children in order to inherit the kingdom. And so that was one of the just unexpected discoveries to kind of trace back. Well, what was Tolkien's religious life like? Oh, it was seeped in the oratory. What was the oratory like? Oh, it was like that. And then come full circle and realize that that explains so much about his life and also about the major themes in the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, I think that you can just see that in so many ways too. Even with Aragorn, he's a backwoodsman, but he's a king. Like, I mean, he's in the lineage of the kings, but he's out there and he's hunting and he's watching out and guarding areas. You find that so much. And I love what you just pointed out, especially about the hobbits, the idea that Jesus said we need to become like children and have the faith of children. And you find these little people who end up being the heroes of the story in the end. But there's also that scholastic side of it too, because in the books you find later that Merry and Pippin actually become very scholastic. They start researching and finding and writing histories and writing uh, different biographies. And then they were honored and able to be buried right next to Aragorn. So they were buried with the kings. I mean, and so what was humble was exalted and made. I mean, you see that all through the writings. It's an extraordinary observation. So that kind of like goes into another question about the characters. I mean, Gandalf is so important. I think that even Tolkien talks about how even Samwise Gamgee was kind of an unsung hero. It seems like he kind of favored Sam a little bit amongst the hobbits at times, where he spoke very highly of him. And I specifically see that in his letters. It wasn't long ago. It took me a very long time to work through the Tolkien letters. Every night I would read about one letter. So you can imagine how long that took. But he has even a soft spot for Samwise and his allegiance to Frodo and his standing by him and his willingness to go with them to the very end, even though his emotions were pulling him. I just finished the Lord of the Rings Fellowship of the Ring the other day. And even Frodo, in the book, he's not the only one that looked into that water with Galadriel. It was Sam, and Sam's instant reaction is like, I got to go home. I got to go home. But reason drew him to stay with the fellowship, and reason drew with him to stick by his commitment to his master. So he had intentionally placed personalities and individuals like that. So what kind of characters do you see the influence of his Catholic faith on these various characters that he sees in his stories?
Well, I want to come back to that
Sure,
point
sure.
because that's a really good point about how Sam. I mean, I love Sam.
It's my
He's the
wife's favorite.
good choice. I mean, there's so many good choices, but he's such a wonderful character because he is so ordinary. And it's his love for Frodo, it's his devotion to his friend, it's his stubborn perseverance that gets him through. And it's notable, he is the only character who's able to put on the ring and then take it off and give it away without any difficulty.
Well pointed out.
That's huge. So he also is a ring bearer, if only for a little bit.
Yes.
He's the only one who voluntarily, of his own initiative, gives it back. Even Bilbo had to be kind of strong armed by Gandalf. There's this whole conversation about, no, you really need to do it. But Sam
Yep.
is able to just basically do it. So Sam, and I love how you pointed out that it's an act of will, though, that he wasn't just kind of, oh, sure, this is fine. He has to make that choice over and over again. And I
Yes.
think this is really rooted in Tolkien's own experience of faith, because Tolkien was a lifelong Catholic, but he wasn't someone who experienced an easy going the whole way. I mean, there's all sorts of difficulties in life. You know, he was an orphan. He fought in the First World War, but his faith life also had ups and downs. He was a bit lacking and lapsing as an undergraduate at Oxford in his first year, has shared with so many young people everywhere. And he brings himself back together, mostly inspired by his love for his future wife, Edith Bratt. But he goes through that rocky spell when he's a young man. He gets on the right track. He gets through the war with his faith intact. But then after the war, he's married. He has children. He has a job. Everything should be smooth sailing. But he goes on to say, he says this to his son many years later. He says that he goes through a long stretch in which he says, I almost ceased to practice my religion. Now, he didn't entirely cease, but he says he almost ceased. And the way he describes it is that he feels a longing for Christ, but an inability to kind of follow through. He feels that he didn't live up to his love for God as he should have. And this stretch, now he bookends it with where he was living. Now, depending on how he's calculating it, it might have been just 2 or 3 years. It could have been as long as 9 years, this stretch. And the way he writes of it, he's very matter of fact. And one thing I've learned about Tolkien's tone from writing 2 books about him is that when he has that quiet, matter of fact tone, he is speaking from the heart. He's acknowledging that he had this dry stretch, that it was very painful for him. And he comes out of it for various reasons, one of which is his friendship with C.S. Lewis. That's very much a case of iron sharpening iron. We can talk about that later if you like. But the point is that he's able later on to write to his sons when they have difficulties in the faith, and basically to remind them that faith is a commitment of the will, that is not about my emotions, that might come and go, but it's a commitment. It's a commitment to Christ. It's a commitment to his church. And that toughness, that sort of fiber in his faith, came by hard-won experience, by going through that dry spell when he didn't feel it. But he never gave up the faith. He almost ceased practicing, but he didn't quite. He didn't give it up. He never lost his faith entirely. And he brings it back. He comes back to a full, robust, and much deeper faith life as a mature, in his 30s and his 40s. And I think that's some of what is informing a character like Sam, when he is gritting his teeth and making the decision to go on, even though he doesn't feel it. Yeah, well, Tolkien lived that. So no wonder it comes across so powerfully in Sam.
Another character I think is important is Aragorn. I mean, there's definitely, it seems like a Christ figure there in the kingship, taking his throne. Obviously there's an influence into the character of Aragorn. So what did you find with his influence on that character specifically?
Well, I think when we get to characters like Aragorn or Gandalf or many of the other characters, Tolkien is very, very clear that he's not writing an allegory. And so we should, it's not, it's just in literary terms, it's just not. There's what he calls applicability, but it's not an allegory. But what we do have are ways in which different characters can sort of present images of the Christian faith or images of Christ, not in a consistent way. Aragorn is not Christ dressed up like Strider,
Right.
But there's ways in which, as you note, he is an image of Christ the King, and also an image of Christ the healer, because he brings healing to the wounded. But he's not the only Christ figure, because we have Gandalf. Gandalf particularly is an image of the resurrected Christ. And there's that very striking scene after he comes back, where Legolas, Gimli, and Aragorn are in Fangorn Forest, and they meet this strange old man. And it's ages before they're even talking with him, before their eyes are opened and they realize it's Gandalf. And it's a very Emmaus Road kind of scene.
Yeah, Luke. Yep. Yep.
But this is Tolkien being very, very, very subtle. If you know the scriptures and you recognize that, it adds a level of depth to that scene. It gives a level of additional power to Gandalf, but it's not necessary. You can read it. And I read it for years without tweaking to this at all, because
Right.
also a really great scene about a very mysterious wizard who has somehow come back from the dead in some very strange way, encountering his friends again. So we have that imagery, but then we also have a double symbol, a double image of Frodo and Sam as they're making their trek to Mordor. This is Christ, the suffering servant. This is Christ, with the cross. But it's both of them, it's both characters. I mean, Sam actually literally carries Frodo at one
Yes,
point.
he does.
So we have all of these sort of different angles, different facets, which I think is really right at the heart of what Tolkien's doing. He's allowing these images to kind of come to the surface here, come to the surface there, as the material allows it, because he himself is so deeply rooted in his faith that it just kind of bubbles up naturally, and then he polishes and then he adjusts. But he's never, I think, setting out to say, okay, let's see, where am I going to put this Christ figure? I don't think there's any of that. It's coming up naturally.
I can see that as well. There's multifacets to what he's doing. He's not just making it a direct, let's connect every single thing about Jesus to this character. It's just here, and then it's there in this scene, and then it's here in that scene. I think one that would be not a character, but an item is the ring. The ring itself, I think, is a very important aspect because it clearly has this idea of the sin, the fight we have with sin, the enticing, the desire, the power. Did any of that resonate with him where he was like, I'm going to create a story about a ring that has such power over people that it could lead somebody to rule all of Middle Earth, something there. It had to be a battle with sin that made him think to do something like this. Where is his story with creating this idea of a ring that gives the power to do these things, and it gives you pleasure and reign and authority and all those things that everybody wants, that Gollum wants, that Gandalf feared? Like, originally I would use this for good, but if I ended up actually doing this, it would make me evil. Galadriel even recognized I would become this queen. I mean, they all recognize its dynamic and its power, that it could, yes, be used for good, but ultimately it would corrupt people, and it would corrupt the intention of good and take over, and evil would win. So where was his involvement in the idea of the ring itself, attachment to the idea of sin?
This is interesting. I have a very specific and clear answer for you, but it's probably not going to be what you expect.
Okay.
Because it was none of that.
Wow. Okay.
And here, I think this is important because we see Tolkien's creative process. Before I get to the ring, I'm gonna quote from memory. There's a very famous quote that he says, "The Lord of the Rings is a fundamentally religious and Catholic work." Very famous quote, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the part that people don't follow up is unconsciously in the writing, but consciously in the revision. It's unconsciously religious in the writing. It's only afterwards that he recognizes these elements. So he's not setting out ahead of time with this intention. It's coming up unconsciously, and then he hones, he polishes, etc. So let's go back to the ring. Now, we can actually trace the evolution of the ring idea, because we need to go back to the Hobbit, because that's where Bilbo acquires the ring.
Right.
There's two versions of the Hobbit. The version that we all know today is not the first version that was published. In the original published version of the Hobbit, the ring that Bilbo gets from Gollum is not the One Ring. It's just a magic ring of the kind you have in folk tales that give you invisibility. They're a dime a dozen, and
many. Yeah.
There's many. So the idea of a magic ring that makes you invisible. In the first version of The Hobbit, which you can actually buy a facsimile edition now that gives the first version. In the first published version of The Hobbit, Gollum is much less scary. And he has a relatively civil conversation with Bilbo. They have the riddling contest. Bilbo wins, and Gollum hands over the ring, and he goes on his merry way. Now, readers of The Hobbit will say that's not actually what happens. He has to kind of trick Gollum to get the ring, and Gollum goes in basically a murderous rampage, and he has to escape by the skin of his teeth. Well, so Tolkien wrote The Hobbit with this magic ring that Bilbo pockets, and he goes on his merry way. How handy! And we have the rest of the story of the Hobbit. The ring is useful, but not a big deal. It's a huge success. It's selling like hotcakes, and his publisher is thrilled to bits and says to Tolkien, "Please write a sequel." And Tolkien says, "Great. I love being able to pay the bills." I mean, he was hard up front. He had 4 kids, a lot of health issues, and there's a story that at one point a check, a royalty statement from the Hobbit came in. He opens it up and he just hands the check over to his wife to pay for their medical bills. Like, it just went straight to that. So Tolkien says, "Yes, I will absolutely write a sequel to this best-selling children's book. I could use the money." And honestly, as a writer, that's a perfectly legitimate, reason to start a project. So he starts casting around for, okay, I'm going to write this book, but I need to have a good story. What have I got? What have I got to make, from The Hobbit that, wrapped up the story? What are the loose ends? What have I got to work with? And he remembers the ring. Well, this magic ring, maybe it's not just any magic ring. Maybe there's something more to it. And then from there, he starts spinning out the story of the Lord of the Rings, and he does not know where it's going to end. It takes him, a decade to finish it. He started it in about 1938. He finished the manuscript in 1949. It took him 10 years to finally figure out where the story would go, and he gets there. The story is deepened. The story has darkened. The ring has become the one ring. And he, in his amazing, powerful, creative imagination, has recognized, I think, that it is a powerful symbol. It has so many wonderful resonances, and he recognizes the resonance with sin, the addictive quality of sin. He's a great artist, and as soon as he starts working with it, he realizes what he's got, and he uses it, and he develops it, and it becomes this profound, potent symbol that can't be pinned down to any one thing. That's part of what makes it so potent. It's not a symbol for anything. It is the one ring, and yet it also reminds us, of so many Christian elements. Even the fact that it's a metal ring. It's sterile. It's closed in. It's not an organic thing. It's dead. So it's got all these resonances with sin and with power and with control. But it started out as that just the little magic ring that Bilbo had. And so he realizes actually that he needs to retcon The Hobbit. So he goes and he rewrites it, and he rewrites that because he realizes this doesn't match anymore. So he rewrites it so that now what Bilbo acquires is the one ring that has gotten a grip on Gollum. And we have that powerful scene where Bilbo could have killed Gollum to escape, but doesn't. And that, as Gandalf says later, is why he was able to take so little harm from the ring, because he started his ownership of it with pity and mercy.
Yep.
And that's a powerful theme. But I just love the fact that this was all a kind of discovery for Tolkien. He didn't have a plan ahead of time. He allowed his creative imagination to work, and look at what it produced.
Yeah, that's an incredible observation. I'm willing to bet most of the people that are going to listen to this, whether they're listening live now, later, or those that are listening on the podcast, I wonder how new that is. I wonder if people actually knew there was a change and a revision. But that's what a good artist does. In my mind, he was an artist. I mean, that's what he is. The man was brilliant. I envy so much of his imagination skills, being able to take things from mythology and scripture, and somehow it just influenced the man. The man just wrote, and then he puts those pieces together later. To me, that's an extraordinary thing, and it's hard to find. When I look at Lewis and I look at Tolkien, I struggle to. It's sad. It's like, man, will we ever have two writers like that again. You know, I'm not saying God can't raise up other men and women to do these kinds of things, but I look at those two, and I want to go back to those two and their relationship, because you mentioned something about the iron sharpening iron. There's a time where Lewis walked away, and Tolkien was there for him and had to reason. And I'm sure there was discussions that they had over a cup of tea that I would love to be a fly on the wall to listen to their discussions, but they were part of clubs together and they shared ideas. And very clearly, in the letters that he wrote specifically to his son and others, he mentions Lewis editing and getting his background. Hey, what do you think about this? Or Lewis said that I should change this. I mean, he clearly valued C.S. Lewis's viewpoints. So talk about that relationship between Lewis and Tolkien and how much that influenced revision, change, and ideas.
Well, you know, and really it is amazing that we have these two absolutely colossal figures. And they don't come into our world very often. I mean, how many Shakespeares do we have, right?
Right.
It's as if we had Shakespeare and an equal Shakespeare in the same era as Shakespeare. Like we've got Lewis and Tolkien right there. It's just, it's astounding. So Tolkien and Lewis met at Oxford in 1926. Lewis had just started working as a tutor, actually in philosophy. He was tutoring philosophy, and Tolkien had come to take up his job, his first professorial post at Pembroke College as a teaching there. And so they met at an English faculty meeting, and they did not particularly hit it off very well. I mean, they met, and Lewis went back and wrote in his diary, "Oh, pale, fluent little chap, no harm in him, only needs a smack or so."
What?
But they soon realized in encounters that they had a shared love of the Old Norse sagas, and that's not something everybody has. So they're
No.
You too. And in fact, they not only loved the Norse sagas, but they were interested in reading them in the original. And,
Wow.
and Tolkien had started a club called the Kolbitar, or Coalbiters, so named because it was after the old Norwegian cronies who would sit so close to the fire that they seemed to be biting the coals. So he set up this Coalbiter club to read Norse sagas in the original, as one does. And Lewis was like, "Sign me up. This is great." And that's where they started to really get to know each other. Now, here's the thing. At this point, Tolkien's a faithful Catholic who's been going through a dry stretch and is starting to, starting to come out of it. He's back in Oxford. He's got some friends who are supportive of his faith. So he's a Catholic. He's getting there. Lewis at this point is an atheist. Lewis had been raised Anglican as a boy, but abandoned his childhood faith and became quite a convinced atheist in his young adulthood. And so the first thing to note is that they really didn't seem to have much in common spiritually, but Tolkien was willing to be friends with him anyway. He was not afraid of people who didn't share his convictions. He could be open to that friendship. And they become friends and they start to talk about things. And Lewis is making his own journey. He gradually becomes convinced of theism, that God exists, but he's by no means a Christian because he can't quite get over this whole idea of like the incarnation and the resurrection. How weird is that? But this is the kind of thing that he's talking about with Lewis. And in particular, there's one really important conversation that he has on Addison's Walk. He's having a conversation with Tolkien and with another friend, Hugo Dyson, and they go walking around Addison's Walk, the circular path in the grounds of Magdalen College, and they start talking about the incarnation and the resurrection and the Christian gospel. And Tolkien makes the argument that Lewis enjoys stories. He enjoys, the stories of dying and rising gods. Well, he says, to Lewis that the Christian gospel is a story just like that, but with one additional factor, that it actually happened in history. It is a story with all the power that stories have, and it's historical. And that seems to have really helped Lewis to make the connection, because he goes off and shortly after he says, yeah, now I am a Christian. I accept Christianity.
Mhm.
And he says that it has a great deal to do with that talk that he had with Tolkien and Dyson. Now, Tolkien is really being very, very affirming and very supportive here, because it's not just this conversation. He also writes a whole poem for Lewis called Mythopoeia, and it's well worth reading. There's a snippet that's often quoted, but it's quite a long poem. It's in the volume Tree and Leaf. And basically, it's apologetics in a poem.
Wow.
And it's astonishing to read it. I unpack that whole thing in one of my chapters in Tolkien's Faith. That's so significant, because he's basically making an apologetics argument to the still not Christian Lewis, saying, okay, we make these stories. Well, how do we even get the capacity for dreaming? How are we even able to know this is beautiful and this is ugly? Because those things come from God. So he's making a really quite a profound apologetics argument through story, through the power of story, because they both acknowledge that. And we know that this had a huge influence on Lewis. But of course, in order to make this argument about the reality of the faith, Tolkien was thinking about it, right? So again, this is strengthening his own faith. All these conversations with Lewis are helping him to become stronger in his faith at the same time that he is helping Lewis. And of course, Lewis was, a very tough-minded kind of chap.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
He would have been arguing, they would have been, well, Tollers, what about that? That doesn't make sense. Well, back and forth in this iron sharpening iron. And the result is that it's so good for both of them. And so Lewis returns to his Christian faith, and this is a matter of great rejoicing for Tolkien. I've heard it said sometimes that Tolkien was put out that Lewis didn't become a Catholic, that he remained as an Anglican, but there's no evidence that that was the case. Now, obviously, Tolkien as a Catholic would have wished for his friend to come, in his view, all the way into what he believed was the fullness of the faith and all of the riches that were available to him. But he was 100% clear that Lewis had become his brother in Christ. He talks about how, yes, he loves the Lord. This is such a matter of rejoicing. And that's what he's happy about. And he recognizes that Lewis, he says, after a long pilgrimage, Lewis has become a lover of the Lord. And he says that talking with him is good for his own faith. I mean, what a beautiful thing that is.
It is. The fact that they got, like you said, we have these two figures that you usually get one in every 100 or so years. We not only have them in the same lifetime, it's not like they were on two different continents. They were living in the same exact location and having tea and conversations and walks and letter writing together and
encouraging each other in their creative work.
Yes.
They're members of the Inkling, so they're reading things aloud there, but they're also sharing their work privately back and forth. And Lewis was a huge encouragement to Tolkien, because Tolkien was actually quite shy about his private mythology, he called it, of the Lord of the Rings. And it was a big deal when he first shared it with Lewis, and he did it before Lewis was a Christian. He trusts him. And Lewis responds so positively, so warmly. It's a great encouragement to Tolkien. And then later, in that long slog, the 9 years that he's writing The Lord of the Rings, he admits that if it hadn't been for Lewis, he would never have finished it, because Lewis kept saying, come on, I want to hear it. I want to know how the story ends. And he says if it hadn't been for that, he wouldn't have ever finished it. He would have just given up.
Yeah, and you can see that in the letters too. In Tolkien's letters, he valued very highly Lewis's feedback, and there has to we all need that friend. Every Lewis needs a Tolkien, and every Tolkien needs a Lewis. I mean, we need that iron sharpening iron. And boy, I mean, what became of all the works? I mean, obviously Lewis very much a theologian and a philosopher, and then he puts his own writings together with Narnia. I mean, it's an incredible thing that we get to see it and even have some of our own ideas and read it. And now everybody wants to make movies and ruin it. But we won't get into that. But there are aspects of this too where kind of picking up now they're sharpening each other, not just as writers, they're sharpening each other in spiritual things. And so another thing that I want to in the last question here bring up is when you're talking about themes come up in both their writings, specifically on Tolkien here. Things like sacrifice, providence, relationships, love, sacrifice, sacrificial love in that sense, redemption. Like these are major themes that we find in both their writings, but specifically in Tolkien. So, kind of as a last question here, because that spirituality was being sharpened with not just him, like you mentioned, there's others that are involved in Tolkien's life too, but Lewis being a big one. Where do these themes become so important for Tolkien? And maybe he was developing them as they went too in his own life and changing and editing and changing and editing. But these are big: providence, love, sacrifice, redemption. These are major themes in the writings of the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, oh, so many good things to talk about. We must choose and focus.
Yeah.
Tolkien self said there are various things he says about the Lord of the Rings and what it's about. But one of the things he says that it's about is death and the desire for deathlessness, which is worth thinking about. That's really interesting because, of course, the ring gives the power to defeat death, but not really. It doesn't actually give you more life. It merely stretches your existing life. And I think that's such a genius articulation of what sin does to us. It promises us things, but evil can never create. Sin can never give us anything good. So the ring doesn't actually give any additional life. It just drags out what you've got. So even Bilbo in the end says, this is such a great image, that he feels like butter scraped over too much bread.
Too much bread. Yeah.
I mean, what a great image for being just
Yes.
overstretched. So, but to get back to the themes, I think the theme of providence that you've brought up is so powerful. It runs through all of the Lord of the Rings. It runs through the Hobbit, but most powerful in Lord of the Rings. And it ties in with the importance of mercy and pity, which I think is really just fundamental. If I had to pick one theme for the Lord of the Rings, it would be that.
Wow.
Because when you think about it, and this is something that Tolkien says in his letters, at the climax of the quest, when Frodo's at the cracks of doom, he fails in the quest. He fails. We forget that. He says in the climactic moment, he says, I will not do this thing. I will not destroy the ring. And he puts it on.
He puts it back on.
Yeah. And this is so shocking. He has failed. And what has happened is that he has been broken. He has been taken to the limits of what he could endure, to the limits of his will and beyond. The ring has broken his will. And so he says, I won't do it. I will claim it. But the quest doesn't fail because Gollum bites the ring off and falls to his doom. Well, why was Gollum there? Gollum is there because earlier in the climb up to Mount Doom, both Frodo and Sam have the opportunity to kill him, and both of them recognize that this would, worldly terms, be prudent because Gollum's trying to kill them. Gollum won't take the ring. So honestly, it's a prudential move, according to worldly wisdom. Kill Gollum. That way we don't have this creepy guy trying to steal the ring and bring it to Sauron and kill us. But no, Frodo is merciful, and so is Sam. They pity Gollum. They see that he has been broken by the ring, and they pity him, and they show mercy to him. And before that, Gollum could have been killed by Bilbo, but Bilbo likewise had pity on him. It would have been safer for him if he stabbed Gollum in the back. That way he would have known that he could have got away. But he risks it. He jumps over Gollum instead, risks it because he's showing pity. He has pity and mercy for Gollum. And the result is that those acts of pity providentially ensure that Gollum is there and the quest is fulfilled, even though Frodo himself is unable to do it because he has been stretched too far. And of course, in the narrative, it's all coherent. Everything fits in with the character actions. But if you see it with the theological eyes, you realize this is providence operating through those actions. And this is specifically the Christian understanding of providence, of mercy as a profound value that is higher than worldly wisdom. And that's just profound.
And I may be wrong with this. I think at one point Tolkien speaks about how the author actually comes into play, but he said it wasn't him that he was speaking of himself. He was clearly speaking of God, the providence of God. I can't remember if that was in his letters or if he said that somewhere else, but he speaks about at that moment of tension where all this is going on, the author steps in, the providence and divine, really, when you're talking about Frodo, sin had already kind of taken over him. And it's an excellent point. He was not the hero in the moment. He failed when he went through all these tests and he passed. He struggled. That one he failed. And providence came in, and that even allowed that through pity of the actions of others. And even Gandalf talks about that. He talks about how the pity of Bilbo would maybe save.
Yeah.
Do a lot of salvation kind of stuff here. So,
and it's important to note that even though Frodo fails, he is still honored. He is still given all that honor, because this is a profoundly Christian vision. Because Tolkien realizes, and he says this in the letters, that Frodo broke, but he gave his all. He gave everything he had, and it wasn't enough, but he gave it all. And so he is glad that the quest is fulfilled, even though he couldn't do it himself, even though he broke. He's relieved, and he is rightly honored because he gave his all. And again, what a comforting vision. Because Tolkien is so humane. He doesn't have an expectation that we just got to tough it out and we can be heroes. He says, no, we may well break, but fortunately we have our trust in a crucified God who is going to redeem us. and that's what we get.
That's so good. That is so good. There's so many things that we could nerd out for the next 50 hours, but you know what? We're wrapping up on our time here, folks. I hope you've enjoyed this, and the audiences are listening after the fact. Many of you that are going to be tuning into this just in a few hours, when you get that notification on your Spotify or your Apple or your Podbean or your all the 7 platforms, you're going to go, hey, here's another Tolkien episode, and you're going to listen to this. And I'm promising you learned something. I learned something, so I know you learned something. We all learned something today. And by the way, and all those that are listening in, there is a link in the actual description of the video where you can buy the book. I would suggest you do that. Read Dr. Ordway's book. It is enlightening. There's a lot of things in there. Like you said, there's even pictures. I mean, what more do you want in life? I mean, there's pictures. There's references to a lot of his poems. There's discussions between him and Lewis. It'll be encouraging. So make sure you do that. There's a link for that in the description. Also, there will be an additional link to the website to follow Dr. Hawley. You can find, I don't know if you have any new works coming out, but yeah, at least the 2 that you have, and just keep up with you and keep up with things that you're putting out there. We're all jealous that you get to go to Oxford and just make it second home. I mean, it's not even fair. Walk on the same ground that Tolkien and others did. But we are thankful that there are writers like yourself and authors who are doing what you're doing, because it really helps us look at these narratives in a better understanding. So we really do appreciate what you do. And we appreciate your time for coming on Facts and people getting to know you and get to follow you from this episode.
Well, it is a pleasure. And really, it's my privilege to be able to do this work. And it is a privilege. I have to say, to be able to do this work and then share it with people and be able to say, here's more that we can love about this great man and his work.
Oh, so much. Well, thank you, Dr. Hawley. We really do appreciate your time. I'll see you backstage to say goodbye, but I'll say goodbye to everybody else as well. Thank you so much. All right, folks, that's all we have time for. Thanks for tuning into this special episode. It's been great. Make sure you like and subscribe if this is your first time. If you're listening on the podcast side, make sure you hit your notifications so that when new episodes release, you're getting instant notification on that. There's many special episodes coming up. I've got Trent Horn coming on soon, starting in September. We're going to talk about sacraments. There's a lot of lineup of individuals. We're going to be going into covenants. We're going to be going into different things in the church fathers. I also am going to be working through some of the synoptic problems because many of you have requested that. So that's what I'm doing. We're going to do a lot of synoptic problems. I just released one 2 days ago on Mark 2:26, responding to Dr. Bart Ehrman and having corresponded with him in the past on things, answering some of his objections, especially in Mark's gospel. So we'll be doing that throughout September and October. There's many other special guests lined up in November and December as well. Well, folks, that's all we have time for today. Grace and peace to you. God bless.